Welcome to the Ayn Rand Center Chicago Speaker Series. The Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, located in Alexandria, Virginia, is the public outreach and policy division of the Ayn Rand Institute. The center is named after author Ayn Rand, whose heroic novel Atlas Shrugged demonstrates why the individual rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness provide the only moral basis for a fully free society, and that any such free society would have to include laissez-faire capitalism. That novel, by the way, sold more than 445,000 copies last year, which is a record. It's the second highest year of sales in the history of the 55-year-old book. In addition to public talks, the Ayn Rand Center engages with public policy organizations and with public intellectuals in debates and panel discussions about current issues and the foundations of politics. We also just started a series of briefings to congressional staffers on the Hill in Washington, D.C. And you can find our speakers on various forums, including TV, radio, print, and online media. We have now established a Chicago chapter of the Ayn Rand Institute here, and if you'd like more information about that chapter or how you can help support and promote the Ayn Rand Institute, see me after the talk. Or you can contact either office in Irvine or in Alexandria. The Chicago chapter sponsors these talks and makes them possible. If you'll notice on the inside of your brochure, there is a listing of the specific donors who made these talks possible, and I'd like now for us to publicly thank them. Okay, before we get started with the actual talk tonight, I want to talk about 3 upcoming events here in Chicago in the next 3 months. The first is a debate. We are holding these debates around the country, and we are bringing this series of debates to Chicago next month in March. David Callahan of the progressive think tank Demos will be debating Yaron Brook, the executive director of ARI, on the fundamental issues underlying our current political and economic frenzy. It will be on the nature of government, and I urge you to come. Bring your friends, bring your family, and this is something you can bring your enemies to. But seriously, this is a really good debate, and I encourage you to attend and to come. A few weeks later, on April 19th, Tara Smith will be giving a talk on happiness. What is it? How can we find it or attain it? And are there tools that will help us to achieve it? And then on May 3rd, we will be holding a fundraising dinner here in Chicago at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, which is formerly the Elysian, to benefit the work of the Ayn Rand Institute. And we'll have a special guest, Stephen Moore of the Wall Street Journal. More details of all of these events are on our websites, and I encourage you to go there and get the information. So now let's get to tonight's talk. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Don Watkins. He's a fellow at the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights, specializing in capitalism and other economically related issues. He is a columnist at Forbes.com with Yaron Brook, and his op-eds have appeared in such venues as Investors Business Daily, Christian Science Monitor, FoxNews.com, and CNBC.com. He has appeared on nationally syndicated radio programs and is a regular guest on PJTV's Front Page with Alan Barton. His book, Free Market Revolution: How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government, which he co-authored with Yaron Brook, will be released in September. Finally, he and Yaron are co-bloggers for a new blog on our Ayn Rand Center, and then the new blog is specifically about capitalism. Laissez-faire, the uncompromised case for capitalism. You can find it at freemarketbook.com. And there are some cards outside with the blog URL on them if you want to pick them up after the talk. Don will be speaking tonight about what's really wrong with entitlements. So please welcome Don Watkins.
Excellent. Can I be heard in the back? All right, so it's not being live streamed, but it is being taped, so this will be seen by more than the people in this room. Okay, what's really wrong with entitlements? So this kind of presupposes that there's something wrong with entitlements. And it turns out that's actually not very controversial today. Of course, why would it work? There's a general agreement among people that the big three entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are facing a real problem. And the number you have to keep in mind is right here, $100 trillion. These programs face $100 trillion, more or less, in unfunded liabilities. That means commitments the government has that it doesn't know how it's going to pay for. Now, that's kind of an abstract number, so I want to make that a little more real to you. This here is stacks of $100 bills equaling $1 billion. This, on the other hand, is $1 trillion. And I don't know if you can tell, but that little speck to the far left, that's a human being. Now imagine 100 of those. That is the shortfall that these programs face. And there's really only two ways that you can ever make up this kind of shortfall. One is to get more revenue through, in the end, higher taxes, or to cut services. Now you can't, in reality, tax your way out of this kind of hole. So this is what people are saying is the problem with entitlements. The problem we face is how do we save the entitlement state in light of the fact that we have this out-of-control spending that we don't really know how to bring back in control. But when I listened to this debate, something kind of jumped out at me as a little weird. Everybody agrees there's a problem, and yet nobody's done anything about it. Nobody's done a thing about it. And indeed, anybody who has tried to do something about it, say Paul Ryan, is basically tarred and feathered. And so imagine, if you will, you walk into a hospital and there's a patient, dying on the table, and there's a bunch of doctors surrounding him, and they all go, yeah, well, we definitely have to operate on this guy, and yet nobody's doing anything. And in fact, one of the doctors tries to step forward and they punch him in the nose. You'd think there's a real question here. What is going on that we have this mystery where action is imperative, action is necessary, and nobody's taking any action at all? And so that's what I wanted to understand. Now you might think, well, this is not the hardest mystery in the world to solve. After all, there's people getting benefits, and they don't want to give up the benefits. Not exactly the world's greatest Agatha Christie novel. But there's certainly a truth to that. There's no question that there is entrenched beneficiaries who don't want to give up their benefits here. But just think about some things that make it clear this can't be the whole story. So first of all, it's important that most people are not a beneficiary of the big three. That it's a minority of Americans who are gaining benefits from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And yet these things are almost universally popular. And indeed, even if you talk to people who say, I don't think these programs are going to be around when I'm old, I don't think that I'm going to see one dime of Social Security. Well, if you ask them, well, then shouldn't we unravel these and phase them out? They'll say, well, no, are you crazy? We need to make them workable. We need to make them sustainable. Second of all, it's simply not true that people will never vote against their perceived financial self-interest. I'm from Southern California, and if you know anything about Californians, we really like voting against our financial self-interest and do it on a regular basis, whether it's voting for tax increases or energy hikes in the name of being green. So this couldn't be the whole story. And so I wanted to figure out this question, this fascinating to me mystery of why is it that entitlements are a third rail? Why is nothing ever done to change them? Well, when I talk to people, almost universally, the answer I'm given for why do we need an entitlement state boils down to some variation of, well, if we don't have entitlements, people will starve in the streets. And indeed, they'll say, before we had entitlements, wasn't it true that people were absolutely starving in the streets? Now, there's no question. None of us want to live in a world where people starve in the streets or anything like it. That's certainly not the kind of world that I want to live in. So I did something a little controversial, and I decided I was going to go look up the history. What was America like in the age before we did have an entitlement state? Now, just as an aside, there was an era before we had an entitlement state. I guess, for those of us who went to public schools, it's not always clear what happened in America a while back. But I mean, the real inauguration of the entitlement state was Social Security in 1935. And so I'm primarily talking about the period leading up to that, and particularly the century leading up to that. So what actually happened there? Well, it turns out people did not starve in the streets. There's nothing close to it. The people were actually able to survive and indeed thrive at the time. And in fact, they found all sorts of amazing, creative ways to cope with life's challenges. So I want to show you a chart, and some of you may have seen this before. This is showing world GDP per capita, so basically the standard of living of human beings going back to 1500. I mean, you can extend this line back as far as you want. Basically, for most of mankind's history, we've lived pretty shabby existence. And a pretty unchanging existence. That for most of our history, it was a real struggle to survive. Now things started getting better, at least in the West, during the 18th century. But what we see here is during, above all, the 19th century, this complete unprecedented explosion in people's standard of living. In fact, I mean, between 1800 and 1900, real wages of work, the average American worker, I mean, they more than quadrupled. And this is something, as we say, that was just never seen before in human history. Now, not coincidentally, something else was happening towards the end of the 18th century and during the 19th. And that was economic freedom. That for the first time in human history, and in particular in the West, people had the right to pursue their life, liberty, property, and happiness, to take responsibility for their own existence, and to engage in full kind of ambitious pursuit of their interests under freedom. And that this is what unleashed this torrent of creativity and productivity that really lifted mankind out of poverty. So capitalism, in other words, was making it possible for people, instead of starving in the streets, to more and more support their own existence, raise their standard of living. Now, if you do decide to look back at what the 19th century was like, it is definitely true that you will find working conditions and living conditions that you would want to be nowhere close to. You'd think, really? People live like this? That's not exactly my ideal world. And that's exactly how historians today will kind of evaluate what was going on then. But what we have to remember is that the relevant evaluation is not that point in the graph to that point in the graph. It's that point in the graph to way down there. In other words, the people at the time were not comparing themselves to the people in 2012. They were comparing themselves to the conditions in the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s. And by that standard, they were thriving like never before. In practice, what did this mean? I mean, you have to really put yourself in a situation where, look, this was a time when people could remember living without illumination at night, and now they didn't have to go to sleep when the sun went down because they had kerosene and eventually light bulbs. This is a time when the fastest mode of transportation started as a horse, and people could live to see railroads crisscross a continent and eventually cars and airplanes. To say nothing of modern medicine, to say nothing of modern sanitation, of food production, life was just getting incredibly, incredibly better. And so the bottom line is that far from starving in the streets, in America, before the entitlement state, individuals were lifting themselves out of poverty, and they were able to prosper thanks to economic freedom. So now I want to show you another graph. This one's really cool. So this shows two different lines. The red line, if you can tell what colors they are, the bottom line, that is the American poverty rate. And actually, if you stretch it back from pre-1962, I mean, for at least a decade, it's going just an incredibly steep downward slope. And then the upward line is real per capita anti-poverty spending. In other words, this is entitlement spending going to things like welfare and food stamps and whatnot. And you see that this is growing. Now, what we see here is that poverty in America was on a sharp decline until really the late 60s. And then it basically flatlines. At the very time when, I mean, if you recall, the mid-1960s are when LBJ is passing his war on poverty programs, his entitlement programs, and these are really coming into being implemented towards the end of that decade. Now, it's no accident, I think, that the poverty rate basically stops dropping as the war on poverty increases. Now, if you talk to an economist, they will tell you that the real core of how we become richer, of how people escape poverty and achieve prosperity, is through becoming more and more productive. In other words, with the same time, the same human effort, we're able to create increasing amounts of wealth. And how that happens? Well, how it happens is that part of what we produce is not simply the things we're going to consume tomorrow, but we produce things that are going to enable us in future to produce more and more and more and more and more. So instead of, for instance, just producing a turnip, you're going to produce, say, a tractor, a new factory, things that are going to increase your level of productivity. But where does capital come from? Well, it comes from savings. It comes from people producing things that they don't consume right away. Well, where does all this anti-poverty spending come from? Well, it comes from reducing people's savings, reducing investment, reducing capital accumulation. And so again, it's no accident that we see, as the entitlement state grows, the ability of people to escape poverty by being more productive, that comes to an end as well. So we have a situation where people are escaping poverty, they're supporting their lives, but you may be thinking, okay, look, makes sense. By and large, people are able to get by, but isn't the entitlement state really about the fact that some people hit hard times, some people slip through the cracks, and aren't we just trying to create some kind of safety net for those exceptions among us? Well, so let's talk a little bit about what happened to the individuals who, say, for some reason or another, couldn't work at this time. Let's say they get sick, they lost their job, something kind of prevents them from this whole process of becoming increasingly more productive. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I just want to talk about some of the essentials that people did to cope with life's challenges at the time. Now, the first thing people did is because they knew there was no government safety net, is they took responsibility for their own lives. And an important way that they did this is by saving. Now, their incomes compared to ours were quite meager, but just as the Chinese save an incredible amount of their incomes, so at the time, people who knew that they were the ones responsible for their lives saved a very high amount of their incomes. And so if a person did lose his job or a person did get sick, he would see himself through, and his family would see themselves through by relying first on their savings. They would also turn to things like commercial credit, and they would also turn to friends and family. Now, sometimes this would be for financial loans, for financial gifts, but many times it would just be, hey, you move back in with mom and dad for a couple years until you get back on your feet. Or mom and dad, now that they can't work, move back in with their children. Or very often you'd have, you go to your local butcher and say, hey, Joe, look, I can't pay you this week, I'll get you next week. Is that cool? And that kind of thing went on all the time in a free, pre-entitlement America. There was also an abundant amount of private charity at the time. And indeed, historian Walter Tratner, he actually disagrees with my assessment of the entitlement state pretty much 1,000%. But we agree on some of the facts of the time. And I mean, he points out that you could go to the average city in that era, and you could find hundreds of pages of charitable organizations that were there just to help out the deserving poor, to take care of those people who otherwise wouldn't be able to eat, otherwise wouldn't have a place to live. Now, he called it an embarrassing amount of private charity. And you can ask in the question period if you're curious why he thought that was embarrassing. But nonetheless, there was an incredible amount of charitable giving at the time. Now, this last point this is so cool. I had never heard of this before, but mutual aid societies. So a mutual aid society was a private organization that people would form where you would join, in effect, kind of a lodge, and you pay membership dues, and it would guarantee you support if certain kinds of bad things happened to you. And so it was, in effect, like a precursor to insurance. And so people were able to privately and voluntarily insure them against things like having health problems, like not being able to work, like taking care of burial rights and so on. And these mutual aid societies were, I mean, they were the most widespread private organizations in America at the time, second only to religious institutions. And indeed, arguably in certain times, were even more widespread. And so this was a way in which people in an era before entitlements were able to respond to the very kind of risks that we're told only the entitlement state can protect us against. But these were not kind of like worthless little holdovers until the government got its act together. In many ways, this was an advantage over and above the entitlement state we have today. And above all, that's for a very clear reason. That is, these were private, so it was not just a one-size-fits-all bureaucratic solution. You got to really look for the society that met your needs as an individual, that met your family's needs. And two, it was voluntary. So you only entered into it if you thought, yeah, this is a good deal. This is actually a net benefit to my life. And so, I mean, you can ask yourself, how many of us would like continue to be pay towards Social Security right now if we had a choice? I mean, I certainly wouldn't. So if the vast majority of Americans could and did support themselves at that time, how much easier would it be today when we're so much richer? When most of the poor have air conditioning, a home, a car. Indeed, 30% of them, I'm not making this up, own 2 cars. It really boils down to this, to kind of summarize where we are and what kind of puzzle we're facing now. So 1, everybody agrees the entitlement state is broken. 2, the entitlement state is unnecessary to lift ourselves out of poverty or to deal with life's risks. 3, the entitlement state indeed keeps people in poverty. So why in the world is it a third rail? Well, again, we can turn to history. Why did we get an entitlement state? Well, I think it's important to realize that the entitlement state was really a product of people with an ideological agenda. That it was not pushed primarily by the man in the street, but by the man in the ivory tower. It was pushed by people, starting with the progressives, who had a different vision of what America should be about. So I said before that America, we really see that graph start taking off, America is a country based on the individual's right to take control of his own life, to take responsibility for his own life, and seek his own happiness, his own joy, his own property. Well, the progressives and their progeny, they had a different vision. And it said that, well, that's too individualistic, that's too harsh, you're leaving people on their own, shouldn't we all be in this together? Doesn't morality require us, as a society, to be our brother's keeper? And so in the name of this moral ideal, that we are our brother's keeper and that we have a moral obligation to serve and sacrifice for the needs of others, they started pushing for the entitlement state And although the progressives themselves were not particularly successful, they were more successful getting regulations through. Their descendants were, so starting in the 1930s and then really taking off during the 1960s and since. Parenthetically, it's interesting that if you look at the way that Social Security was passed, there was a lot of resistance among Americans to it. And indeed, FDR had to present this redistribution program not as a redistribution program, but as an insurance program, which it most emphatically is not. And this by itself should give lie in our minds, or at least cast intense suspicion on the idea that the poor were starving in the street. You know, if people were massively starving in the street, it's a little suspicious that it would be so hard to convince them to, actually take some money and some food. So now, this then is the answer to why I think the entitlements are a third rail. It is because morality is a really powerful force in human life. It is a really powerful force in human life, and the moral views that we've been taught since we were children in every aspect of life is this idea that we are our brother's keeper. And once you have that as a moral ideal, well then there's no question you're going to get an ever-expanding and never-shrinking entitlement state. So now we can come to what I regard as the real problem with entitlements. Now, it's not primarily that they're insanely expensive. Now, they are insanely expensive, and that is a problem, but it's not the basic or fundamental problem. What was striking to me when I hear any debates over entitlements is that the focus is always on the recipients. It's always, does the entitlement state make the recipients better off? What nobody ever talks about is the people who are paying for it, the producers, the ones who are creating all the goods that are being redistributed. Because if it weren't for them, well then we'd be back at that flat line living on $1 per day. It's they who are providing all this wealth, all of the goods and services that are redistributed through the entitlement state. And so I think to reach a real assessment of the entitlement state, the question we need to ask is, what does it do to the producers? These are not the producers. Dogs produce exactly nothing. They are great consumers, though. Has anybody here ever read the book Where the Red Fern Grows? Okay, well, it's one of my favorites. And it starts the story, so this is taking place in the Ozarks back in the 30s. And there's a little boy, he's 11 years old, and he decides he wants 2 hounds because he wants to be able to hunt in the Ozarks. But there's a problem. He's dirt poor, and the hounds cost $50. So he gives up? No. He decides, all right, I'm going to earn this $50. And so the book kind of describes what he goes through. I mean, he's catching crawfish with his hands and selling them, buckets of them to fishermen for 15 cents a can. He's picking blackberries. If you've ever picked blackberries, you know that the plants are covered with thorns. So he's coming home all bloody, getting 10 cents for a whole can of blackberries. It takes him 2 years, but he finally gets these 2 dogs. Now, I want you to imagine, say, local Sheriff Obama wanders upon him and his 2 dogs, and he says, "Hey, great job. I'm really impressed with your success, but we have a problem. We have a problem of unfair dog distribution. We need to have equality in the number of dogs, because poor Billy down the street, he has 0 dogs, and you have 2. So look, I don't begrudge you your success. I'm not going to take away your 2 dogs. But why don't we give Billy one of your dogs? Then we'll have dog equality." Now, I mean, this would be obviously just so atrocious and so wrong. There's a real sense that people have that it is wrong to take something from somebody that he has earned. If a person's earned it, if they've exercised the effort need to gain it, well then, by what right do you take it and give it to somebody else who didn't earn it? So let's take a step back then. What are entitlements? Well, in the simplest, an entitlement is when the government gives somebody money simply because he needs it. Somebody has a need, and the government comes along and says, here, we'll take care of it for you. So where does the government get the money? Because the government doesn't have any money, right? The government has to get it from producers. It has to take it from those of us who do create stuff, who do earn money. Now, where did we get it? Again, we earned it. We went to work, we went to a job, we exercised our productive ability, and we come home with a paycheck. And what the government does is says, well, we'd like to take some of that paycheck and we'd like to give it out to causes that we regard as better, as more worthy. And what would happen if you refused to give the government money? Would it say, oh, well, thank you, see ya? No, I mean, the government's not asking for donations. It will take the money. And if you still won't give it, the government will put you in jail. It will pull a gun on you in order to take that money and give it out to those it regards as worthy. So, question. How is that different in fundamental terms from stealing? How is that different from the kind of scenario I painted with the boy from the red fern? Well, the only answer that's ever been given is that in one case, morality commands it. If we are a brother's keeper, then it is right to take from people what they earn and give it to people who didn't earn it. Well, in my view, though, that is not an explanation for why this is in a morally different category than stealing. What this is, it's an indictment of the morality that says we are a brother's keeper. Just think of yourself for a minute. Let's say for some reason or another, you need an operation and you can't pay for it. Now, how would you deal with that kind of scenario? I mean, I'll tell you what I would do. I would go to my friend or my neighbor and I'd say, hey, look, I'm in a really rough spot right now. I'd really appreciate it if you would help me. I know it's not your obligation. I know it's not my right, but it would mean a lot to me if you help me. And I think that's what most Americans in their private lives would do. Now imagine a different scenario. And you might have to imagine it since, all right, there we go. Imagine a different scenario where a neighbor marches up to your house, pulls a gun and says, I'm in need, give me your wallet. After all, you may have earned the money, but I'm the one who needs it. Now, here's the thing about the entitlement state and about the you are your brother's keeper morality. According to that, your neighbor is in the right. And you, wanting to keep your money, you are wrong. Now, I regard that as a moral obscenity. But it's worse. Because think about it. Who does this benefit? Who gains from such a setup? And who loses? Well, take Social Security, for instance. Who loses in the Social Security setup? Well, it's the rational, responsible, productive person. The kind of person who would have spent his money rationally, carefully, to really tend to his own life. Maybe he would, instead of saving for retirement, say, I need to use everything I've got right now to invest in my business and, start saving for retirement in a couple of years. Or maybe he would start saving for retirement. And then he'd think carefully about where to invest it, how to save it, how to diversify it, and so on. Who would win then in such a setup? Well, it's not going to be the person who just suffers through no fault of his own. As we've seen, that kind of person is able to survive and thrive. I guess we're in a big city. That happens all the time. He's able to survive and thrive, as we've seen, in a world without entitlements. No, the beneficiary is not the unable. The beneficiary of the entitlement state is the unwilling. It's the people who are irresponsible, unproductive, who couldn't be bothered to think 4 days into the future, let alone 40 years. So the bottom line is that the entitlement state is sacrificing the best of people and the best in people to the worst. So we face a real choice in this country. What kind of country do we want this to be? What kind of country do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a dog-eat-dog nation that punishes productive Americans for the sake of parasites who feel entitled to other people's wealth? Or do we want to be a nation of free, productive, independent individuals who deal with others not by picking their pockets, but through mutually beneficial voluntary trade? Which is truly the moral society? Thank you. All right, so thanks again for coming out. I'm going to take questions until either you guys run out or Lynn kicks us out of the room. And if we do get kicked out of the room, you can still come up and ask me. But I also want to encourage you, as she said, I have cards with both our blog address and it also has my email address out there. And I definitely would love to hear from you if you guys have any comments, criticism, recommendations, anything. I mean, I really do this to try to be a resource to people who are interested in these issues, because I'm very interested in these issues. And I also encourage you on September 18th to buy my book, and even more than that, it should be available for pre-order in the next 4 to 6 weeks. And if you do pre-order it, that helps us a lot, because it really makes a difference in kind of how the book gets pushed beforehand. So with that, you can line up the microphone and I'll start taking questions.